My name is Michael McComis. I'm the Executive Director with ACCSC. Myself, and I'll let Alicia introduce herself, or we're going to talk a little bit about distance education today and some of the things that we're finding with regard to our reviews and our assessments, and just share a little bit of insight with regard to those things. So Alicia?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Alicia DeMartini. I'm our Director of Accreditation here at ACCSC, and just wanted to take a little bit of time this afternoon, talk about some of the things that we've seen in the field, some of the things that we're running into that we just want to make everybody aware of, and go forth from there.
Great. So just some house cleaning items, and then I'm going to switch over and we'll get our presentation going. We've got some staff that are monitoring the chat, and so we'll be kind of trying to look at that as we're talking. We might get some notes from staff passed to us, or physical or virtual, so we can keep pace with those things. We do want you to have an opportunity to ask questions. Disclaimer up front, not sure that we can answer any or all of those questions. There are many ways and many different kinds of scenarios that we find out in the field. And so hopefully we hit on some of the high points, but we do want to do our best to try and answer those. And if we can't come up with with an answer, right away, then we will certainly be, looking to try and get back with you in some other capacity, whether it's an email or a phone call or something along those lines. We'll still do our best to try to get all of those things and those questions answered. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give us just 1 second to get this PowerPoint set up, and then we'll be able to kind of dive right in. So, Michelle, can you see that on the screen? Great. Michelle's in the background here and helping us out. So let's talk just a little bit about really how we came to the place of wanting to talk a little bit about what we're finding with regard to distance education. So obviously, we've seen significant growth in distance education since 2020, since the pandemic, where there was a significant, kind of shift that, really required institutions and accreditors, and to some degree states and other regulatory entities, to very quickly shift either methods of delivery, methodologies, and where an institution maybe had never participated in distance education before, had to very quickly ramp up and look at what opportunities there were. So prior to 2020, those institutions that were offering what we would consider to be, true distance education, was less than 20%. Obviously, post 2020 and through the COVID-19 pandemic, that number would have gone up between 80 and 100%. In some form, fashion, or capacity, whether it was we've set up a Zoom account and we're delivering, what were our classrooms, classroom lectures, and we've taken all the lab out for the short term, and we're just using this capacity. The commission, in our particular case, not sure what states required, not sure what the department required in every instance, but ACCSC attempted to really work with institutions to find pathways forward to keep students in school, keep them engaged and interacting to the extent that they could. Again, with many institutions that either had no or little knowledge or experience with distance education methods, and with a lot of students that had little to no experience in distance education, or even wanting to go to school via distance education. So everybody had to really shift, and everybody really had to be flexible. And so while we went through and reviewed every single one of those distance education applications, many institutions were afforded, the benefit of the doubt, because we simply were not in a position to be looking for a lot of background information. Everybody, again, was pivoting very quickly. So what have we found post-pandemic? And that's what we really want to talk about today, is a little bit about our experiences, and maybe give institutions some heads up, tools and resources that they can think about as they're preparing for their next renewal of accreditation. This next renewal for many institutions is going to be the first time that you're including distance education in your application for renewal of accreditation. This may be the first time that ACCSC is coming out to evaluate distance education since the pandemic. And so how are those expectations going to be met? What has the institution done, or in some instances have not done, with regard to looking for that? So we want to talk a little bit about those expectations. And as we're moving forward and beyond that, kind of resetting the level in the playing field for what those expectations are for the commission with regard to distance education standards.
I do think, Michael, it's also important to note that in some cases, there needs to have been adjustment for schools that were approved prior to the pandemic, because distance education itself has shifted across the industry. So not just for schools who went through distance ed as part of the pandemic, but also those schools who had it prior to.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's start at the beginning with this is the commission's definition of distance education. It's a formal process in which the institution and the instruction within a program occurs when the student and the instructor are not in the same location at the same time. So that allows for both electronic technologies, telecommunications, learning management systems, things of that nature, and maybe either in a synchronous or an asynchronous nature. So asynchronous might be, hey, we're doing this at the same time, but we're not in the same location. Mm-hmm. So asynchronous distance education. Synchronous distance education. Asynchronous would be, I'm neither in the same location and or at the same time with the instructor. So I'm doing this via recorded materials, videos, recorded Zooms and things. So many of the distance education programs and delivery methods that we encounter are a combination thereof. There may be some synchronous time and some asynchronous time. It may be exclusively asynchronous, or it may be exclusively synchronous. We've seen them in every shape and form. But in either case, there is a set of set-alone standards in Section 9 of the Standards of Accreditation that really, in addition to all the other 8 sections, these are the things to really be keeping in mind for distance education. So we want institutions to go through and really make sure, particularly as you're preparing for that next visit, that you've really taken some time to read through that section. We're not going to read through that section for you. That's not the purpose of this webinar, but we're going to hit some of the high points, but it really is incumbent upon the institution to have done that. And then, of course, this can be for a complete program, 100% distance education, or for a portion of a program, colloquially referred to as hybrid. It can be referred to as something else, but oftentimes is simply referred to as a hybrid program, a mixture of both distance education methods along with residential or in-person. So let's move on. And so I see we've got a few raised hands. And what I think we might prefer to do at this point is for folks to put their questions into the chat, right,
Yes.
Alicia?
Yeah, I think that would be a better way for us to kind of.
Right, yeah, that because frankly, I don't think that I can call on somebody and have you ask a question in the webinar. I don't think that's an option. So so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put that question into the chat, and then we'll take a peek at that as well.
I do think you touched on a good point about section 9, that it is in addition to the other sections of the standards, and it does reference back to things in other sections of the standards. So be aware as you're reading through that and incorporating that. Hopefully you already have, but just in case you're maybe new or dusting it off, that you take a look at the reference points back to other sections in the standards.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think admissions is a really good point. It will say, in addition to everything that's otherwise required in the sections above, these are the other things that you have to think about and to consider. So we're going to just kind of, again, hit on some of these high points, and then we'll take it kind of point by point. So Alicia, do you want to talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, so that, as we spoke about, section 9 is really where a lot of this information comes from. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint trying to figure out where we're talking about, that's a really good reference point to head back to. But some foundations of distance education, right? We talked about what we've seen. We've talked about what our definition is. Now, here's a little bit more in the foundational area for distance education. And so first and foremost, it has to be monitoring the online academic engagement. There has to be a policy for that. There has to be monitoring that happens as part of that. It's not just we have a Zoom account and that's our distance education platform. So important piece there for sure. That distance education has to be regular and substantive interactions by trained instructors, right? There's a training component in section 9 that's important to keep in mind as part of this, for that timely and meaningful interaction that occurs both between instructors and students, and also among students. I do think sometimes we see one or the other, but not both. In some instances, you know, many schools are doing both, but just as a reminder that it does need to be both students and faculty and among students.
And you've got trained highlighted.
I do.
I think that might, I don't know, it indicates to me that you might want to talk about that a little
bit more.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is not just that you have an instructor, right? They are already, per section 3, that they are trained to teach, to be a faculty member. This is in addition to that being trained to teach. It is one thing to be trained to teach in the discipline that they are teaching in, is a separate thing to be trained to teach in a distance education environment. And you might have outstanding instructors who are able to do face-to-face classroom, non-distance education instruction, who might struggle in the distance education environment, which is why it's important to do both the training and also the evaluation and assessment, not only of classroom time, in particular in a hybrid program, that classroom time, in addition to the distance education time that faculty member is spending in that platform and environment.
Yeah, and this is a prime example of one of those areas where pre-pandemic, no instructors had any training that had never, offered or been part of a distance education program before, had no training in distance education methods. And so, there is a generalized thought out there about, kind of some of the unique characteristics of teaching at a distance, supporting students at a distance. And so while we may have, or I should just say did, approve many programs and many institutions to offer programs via distance education without first seeing that the instructors had in fact had that training. And now, again, in order to pivot and support the institutions to move forward quickly, we looked at your plan to provide that training for students and found that to be, if the plan was sufficient, we would provide the approval What we're finding now in the onset evaluations is the plans have not always been effectuated. That's, again, one of the reasons for this webinar, is to really have institutions go back, look at that original application, look at what you told ACCSC, and check the boxes of the areas where you said you were going to do some things and whether or not those things have been done, and get those into the fabric of the institution's normal operations, if the institution wishes to continue to retain its distance education approval. And I should say up front, we've also seen many institutions who have chosen not to, and have simply, we had it for the pandemic's purposes. We really don't think that it's the right thing for our students in the way that we provide education, or the type of education that we're providing, so we're going to give it up. And so when we get that renewal application, it doesn't include the continuation of their distance education approval. That is a choice for institutions to make. But it will be important that as we're looking at these things, that you are doing those things that you had indicated in that application, and as the standards really require as you move forward.
And along that line, if you do choose to give up that distance education, you do need to notify us in some way of that you have decided not to go forward with distance education. Alternately, if you are not currently running distance education, but it is something that you want to maybe hang on to and maybe make sure that you've got that, certainly something to consider as part of it, but there will be a capacity question that comes out of your on-site evaluation if it's been more than 24 months since you've had distance education operation at your campus. And certainly if you were to go an entire cycle of accreditation without utilizing the distance education modality, then it would cease to exist. The approval of it would cease to exist at your institution.
Right. All right. So we wanted to talk about asynchronous versus synchronous.
I think we touched on that already as far as what it is. And I think it's important to, again, take a look at what you said you're doing with as part of implementing distance education. And it might have adjusted. It might have switched. It might have been when you first started this, everything was synchronous because that was the quickest way to get up and running during the pandemic. And you sent in information saying you were running synchronously. But since the pandemic, as knowledge has increased, as conversations with students and student satisfaction reviews and assessments have been done, it might be that you've moved to synchronous and asynchronous, or entirely asynchronous, and that would be different than what you would have told ACCSC that you were doing.
And making those changes and adjustments, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Those are the kinds of fine tuning that we would expect institutions to do. Again, as you're going through that first renewal, though, those questions are going to be, how has the institution determined the appropriateness of these methods? And so what can you rely upon as you're looking to support and justify and provide a foundation for the distance education delivery methods that you've chosen?
And I think along with that is the idea of credit hours versus clock hours.
Well, this one got a little bit of attention.
It did.
Last year, 2024, through the negotiated rulemaking process, because there was a move by the Department of Education to make asynchronous clock hour programs ineligible for federal financial aid. That did go through the session, but was not ultimately promulgated by the department in its last round of changes. So while it did go through the negotiating parts, it did not go through the rulemaking part. So as far as we are aware here at ACCSC, there has been no change federally with regard to the eligibility of clock hour, asynchronous clock hour programs to be eligible for federal financial aid. And frankly, we don't encounter very many of them. because they are very difficult to really offer, because as Alicia has noted here, you do need to track, you still need to track the clock hours specifically. And oftentimes clock hour programs are very, very heavy, not always, but they are very, very heavy in terms of hands-on. And so having that hands-on instructional time with an instructor together in the same place is the typical approach for a clock hour program. And if you're going to supplant or supplement some of those clock hours in a distance education environment, it's really going to be incumbent upon the institution to demonstrate why that is appropriate and equivalent to the in-person training methods. And so that is the, again, what is incumbent upon the institutions to make that determination. With regard to credit hours, there's more flexibility there, but the requirement is still that an institution has a responsibility to demonstrate equivalency. And so that equivalency can come, we see it in a variety of ways. Tracking students' online time, looking at the way that they engage with the materials, how much time, are they spending, quote unquote, kind of outside of the classroom doing assignments, estimated time to go through the classroom materials, whatever the case might be. But those equivalencies, again, incumbent upon the institution to determine, hey, here's how we determine this is worth a 3 credit, equivalent to a 3 credit residential course, given the materials and the methods that we're using. And so, again, that is a part of the review process that we go through with institutions to approve those kinds of programs.
I was going to say, I do think it's important to remember when you're tracking that attendance that students are pretty savvy. So if you've got a webinar that you believe is an hour, but it's recorded and you can speed it up to 1.5 times or 2 times, and you're saying it's going to be an hour, but it's only taking them 20 or 30 minutes to watch it. There's that attendance tracking piece, that how much time is this really taking students? That's a piece of that we've seen schools get a little bit sideways on and have to reassess and make some changes to how they're offering distance education.
Yes, and I think as a matter of relevancy here, again, because there are many taxpayer dollars that help support these kinds of programs, there is interest in ensuring through the regulatory community that these distance education programs are in fact equivalent. And that, I don't think that institutions want to be in a position to have to really try and answer that question. Now, to Alicia's point, nothing that you can do about a student that takes the video and then puts it on, 2x. But there certainly should be ways for institutions to monitor that and see, what are the ways in which students are engaging with the materials. And then the last thing that we wanted to talk about, here is just, and we've touched on it already, hybrid versus 100% online. And this could be, 10% online and 90% residential. It could be the opposite of, 90% online and 10% residential. But the key thing here to remember is that any requirement for colloquially what we'll call boots on the ground,
yes,
for the student to be engaged in the curriculum in an in-person setting, any element of the curriculum makes that a non-100% distance education program. And that includes requirements for externships, clinicals, or other things where the student has to show up somewhere as part of that program. So that makes it a hybrid program. So, the definition of 100% distance education is when I'm taking this completely, when I'm meeting that definition of not at the same time at the same location. So that is an important distinction as well. Okay, so just a few more points that we want to make on some of the key things, and then we're going to talk a little bit about student achievement. So Alicia?
Sure. The definition we did, right? The foundations we did. So a little bit of framework to distance education from an ACCSC perspective here. Qualified management and administration, and we've certainly seen a few schools get tripped up by this. And what is qualified? How does that work? What are teams going to look for? What is the application? What are staff looking for as they're reviewing the application? And we want to be clear, it is more than just participating in an online environment. So
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
But you're going to.
Well, I took a distance education course when I was in college. I mean, clearly that qualifies me to oversee one, does it not?
Really wish it did, but no.
Okay, good to know, because that does seem to be the measuring stick that many institutions are using.
Right. I've participated, I've completed some type of diploma, degree in an online environment. So
In 1970.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
By correspondence,
Yeah.
by the way. Yes.
So therefore, I'm qualified to be that management and administrator for distance education.
Are you?
No,
Oh,
I'm really
okay.
not. I'm really not. So we do get questions as to what are the qualifications, right? What is being, what's the expectation here?
And because oftentimes, again, distance education, by the very nature of the fact that at least our commission has determined that it is unique enough to have its own section in the standards. That is a signal that there are some unique characteristics for overseeing those programs, designing those programs, developing those programs, implementing those programs, ensuring that students stay in those programs. All those things have a unique characteristic to them. And so the starting point is, well, what is the platform that the institution is using? What is the methodology that the institution is using? And have I, as an administrator, gone through and taken some kind of educational, foundational training around how that platform works or how that methodology works? And why did we choose synchronous versus asynchronous? Or why did we choose this approach versus that approach? And using that as justification for why essentially an accreditor can look at an online program and the delivery around that program and issue confidence. That's what a stamp of approval is, and accreditation's imprimatur means that there is a level of confidence that is given to that institution that that is a quality program. So how is the institution demonstrating the quality of its oversight, delivery, and design of that program if nobody at the institution has ever really done any work in and around distance education?
Right.
That's what it comes down to. At the end of the day, you may have pivoted, the institution may have pivoted to this approach. Where are we today? And what have we done to educate ourselves as the purveyors, as the operators of these institutions to continue to offer these programs in this way? And how can we provide our accreditor with a high level of confidence that essentially we got this?
And I think the today and the continued are key pieces there, because it's not just a one-time either, right? In the same way that the expectation of the commission is that management and administrative staff complete ongoing training in their roles, that also applies to distance education. So it is not, well, we did it for the pandemic in 2020. We did the, one time they did their piece and we're just going based off of that. There needs to be that ongoing continuous training and professional development in this area too.
And institutional assessment and improvement activities, right? I mean, so the commission has really looked at the way to say to institutions, we're less concerned about the format. We're more concerned about and interested in the substance of what institutions are doing around this ongoing assessment, this ongoing improvement. In distance education, now that your institution is offering programs using those methods, have you gone through and really looked at incorporating those within your activities? And so it is you know, once you get that that approval, there is an expectation that, again, that's an added element to the flavor and the fabric of your institution. So how is it being included in your improvement activities? What data are you collecting to see whether or not students are in fact learning? Not necessarily are they satisfied, although that's of course important data, but what do we know about what they are learning? And what assessments are being used along those particular lines? What improvements are being engaged to keep students engaged in the program? And that is really one of the greatest challenges around that. We'll get to that under student services.
Right. So that next area that we've got listed there is that protection of student information. And it's a little bit broad on purpose because there are a couple of things that go into this. Certainly there's, you know, taking a step back, your emergency preparedness talks about anything that you utilize in an online platform, ensuring that there's protection from that, from cyber threat, from other things of those nature, of that nature. So the distance education is really just sort of a step beyond that to ensure that you're protecting that student information in that distance education environment. And I will say we've also seen an uptick in potential cheating scandals and integrity in the distance education environment. And that needs to be part of this consideration of protection of student information too, because that student information is also their grades and their documentation of achieving those outcomes and those program objectives. And how are you ensuring that the student who has signed the enrollment agreement is the student who's completing that material to earn that credential that you are giving them, that they are achieving at the end of that program?
Well, and let's not forget that last year the commission implemented a standard along those very lines because of what Alicia is talking about, this kind of uptick in educational integrity. And we certainly have seen cheating rings, sharing of information through an institution's own distance education portal. And so that's what we're, you know, as you open up your institution, those are questions that you need to be thinking of and mindful of. Whether it's cloud-based or server-based, how are you ensuring that the records that you maintain for institutions and the institution's own records continue to be secure through those open access points? And whether it's the LMS that you've chosen, the provider, the vendor, whether it's homegrown, whatever the case might be, what steps has the institution really taken along those lines? So student services, it kind of ties right in, but again, our experience in working in distance education for many, many years. I was with the commission when we did our first distance education studies in the 90s. And as we developed our distance education standards in the late 90s and reviewed and researched this significantly. And what we have found consistently through that time is that students engaged in particularly asynchronous environments require significant more touch points and significantly increased number of opportunities to engage in other forms and fashion. Now, Alicia already talked a little bit about the requirements around faculty and student interaction, student-to-student interaction. All of that is true as well, but there needs to be opportunities for administrative interaction as well. And so whether that is through tutoring or advising or counseling or expanded office hours for faculty or whatever the case might be, whatever the needs are of your students, your student services program is going to look different for those distance education students than those students that are in the program and in the building every day, who can just walk down the hallway and knock on somebody's door and say, hey, I have a question about my financial aid, or hey, I have a question about my test that's coming up next week. Instead, students engaged in a distance education environment are going to need to know specifically how they can reach out, where they can reach out, who are the right folk, and when, and how to engage that more likely than not virtually. And so really open access and opportunity, and one might even say expanded access and opportunity might be the way for that to go. Now, that's not to say that the commission has an expectation of 24/7 on-call student support services, but you may encounter students who feel like they should have 24/7 access to you and your staff. So expressing what those expectations are, so the students understand, and knowing, again, having a clear statement of access along those lines can really be helpful and important.
And Michael, I do think the scalability on that is important.
Right.
Your student services are going to look different if you have 1 day a week in an online environment versus if you have 4 days a week in an online environment. And it may be different term to term if you're the type of institution that has 1 month on campus and then 1 month in distance ed. It may be that you have different student services availability between those months for what that looks like, because on the month that they're online is not going to be when you have extra office hours on campus necessarily for students to stop by, because that interaction won't happen in the same way.
Yeah, I feel like we should have led with that.
Yeah.
Because that's probably one of the key and fundamental factors here is scalability. But I think we just take it for granted here a little bit because it applies to everything. Because every institution has some elements that are uniquely characteristic to that institution and to those programs. So so that scalability of how I put all the pieces together into the mosaic that creates a final kind of piece of art, which is your institution, is always going to be a little bit different. So again, this issue of scalability is am I offering this hybrid? Am I offering it 100%? Is it one program, all programs? Is it a portion or not? So there are many different factors, but the institution is the one that has to make those assessments, has to make those determinations, and has to really be working towards ensuring that it has all the pieces in place. Okay, talk a little bit about program advisory committees, because this is one that we have seen a lot of findings during onset evaluations. We just want to make sure that we take a minute to give you maybe a little bit of insight into this.
Right, and it doesn't replace, again, anything that's required for that program advisory committee across the board for every institution. But in addition, if you offer distance education modality, and that's even if it's the one course in all of your programs, there's still a requirement that you have a qualified distance education PAC member. And similarly to the way we talked about for management and administration, your completion of the correspondence course in the 1970s would not qualify you.
But I've got a cousin that is enrolled in a distance education program. Does that qualify?
Still no.
Okay.
Still
well, not independent either, I suppose.
No, not either.
Yeah,
but,
probably not.
But yes, that person needs to, again, not just have completed in the environment, but can speak to and provide a meaningful review of the content and the platform. And we just want to be clear that you can have one distance education PAC member for all of your programs, but there does need to be that review and interaction between that member and the rest of the members. You can't just have your one distance education PAC member be over here talking about the content and the platform while everybody else meets about the program. You can, we've seen best practice be that all of the programs meet at the same time with the distance education person. They discuss the distance education components. There's the interaction about distance education, and then they break up and go talk about the individual program specific items. By the same token, we've seen corporate program advisory committees where there is one distance education person for a number of programs across a number of campuses. And so there are ways to utilize that person effectively among a variety of programs that you have at your institution that are doing distance education.
Right. Do make sure that as again, you're preparing for upcoming reviews and on an annual basis, you've found that resource and you are utilizing that resource. Again, an external check, an external validation point for the institution to say, yes, we've had somebody come in and look at our methods, got some feedback, making some changes or not, depending upon what that feedback might be.
And clearly identify who that person is and how they are qualified.
Yeah.
Because in many instances, just reading their title is not going to let a staff member on an application or an on-site evaluation team know that they are qualified to be that distance education PAC member.
Right. Well, let me shift gears here just a little bit and talk about student achievement. I think most institutions know or should know, really, at this point, that ACCSC does have benchmarks for graduation rates and for employment. And relevant to distance education is probably the most relevant of those two are graduation rates. And so the commission has not established different or separate rates for distance education because it is a method of delivery that should, if done well and correctly, should yield the same level of engagement and opportunity for completion and supporting students to complete the programs. And at a high rate, those benchmarks are if you've ever sat in on any of our other presentations, you know that those benchmarks are set at a standard deviation below the average. So it's really just capturing the performance of programs that are in the lower tiers. And so trying to understand what are the issues. What we are encouraging institutions to think about here is you have this your graduation, your retention data on a rolling and, for all intents and purposes, a real-time basis. Our suggestion to institutions is don't wait till the 2027 annual report to figure out what your graduation rate is for 2024. And then say, oh, well, yeah, that was really low. We should start doing some things now to try and fix it for the future. At that point, the question is, well, what's been happening all this time? So we're really encouraging institutions to use that real-time information that you have. Don't just wait for the graduation and employment chart formula and start making your assessments at that point. You know when students are dropping out, and to the extent that you're paying attention and can get the information, you should know why they're dropping out. And if they're dropping out at a higher rate in your distance education programs, and if they're dropping out at a significantly higher rate in your distance education programs, that is going to have an institutional impact. And so ask those questions now. Determine and attempt to determine now what are the issues that students might be facing. Why are they unable to stay in school in a distance education program at a disproportionate rate than those students that may be there every single day or every other day, whatever the schedule might be, on campus? And if you're seeing that phenomenon, then what strategies is the institution employing to try and determine how to overcome those factors? So unless you disaggregate the data and really look at the manner in which those programs are offered and how and why institutions, or I'm sorry, how and why students, or when and why students are leaving, waiting until, again, an on-site evaluation from ACCSC may be too late. And so we're really encouraging institutions to keep a very close eye on this and to really look for ways that you can work through those kinds of issues proactively instead of reactively. And so we hope that that will be something to look at. Now, here's one of the things that we find is I won't say that there is a causal relationship between admissions requirements and expectations and retention, but certainly there is some correlation between those things. And so what the standards require is that in addition to all the other requirements of Section 5 under admissions, that Section 9 dealing with distance education says if you're admitting students into a distance education program, whether it's hybrid or 100%, there's an additional piece here. And that is really looking at the student's readiness, preparation, potential likelihood to be able to complete this program in that kind of learning environment. And so it is a unique environment for most students, even for high school students, recent graduates that are coming out of the pandemic that did spend some time in their elementary and high school years going to school online. That experience that they probably had, is not going to be the same that they will experience at your institution, more likely than not. As many elementary and secondary schools may have transitioned, again, very quickly to distance education, doesn't mean that automatically equipped students to either A, like, or B, be prepared to learn in that environment. And so it is important still for institutions to go through and do an assessment of what is the likelihood that this student can operate, can learn in this kind of environment. Now, that doesn't mean asking questions like, can you write an email? Can you convert a Word document to a PDF? Can you turn a computer on? And I say these as real examples that we have seen in terms of the assessments about a student's preparation to participate in distance learning. Those are not typically sufficient assessments. We are looking at, and the commission is interested in, what kinds of factors are you seeing in your institution where students are indicating that they don't stay in school for certain kinds of reasons. And many of these do revolve around things like learning styles, an ability to be self-directed in their studies, an ability to be able to succeed through managing their own time, particularly in those asynchronous coursework where there is an expectation. You may say, hey, you can do this anytime you want in your bunny slippers, 2 o'clock in the morning. But are they going to do it? And so that is typically. So what kinds of admissions processes prior to admission and matriculation of the student is the institution looking to engage to make those assessments? Now, this doesn't mean that you have to turn every student away that doesn't maybe answer every single question the right way because they simply don't know or they're not prepared. But what if they're not passing those kinds of assessments? And what is your plan for if they're just passing those kinds of assessments? Is there additional support that you have in play and in place that says we can identify that this student is on the left-hand side of the bell curve and their likelihood of success in this program? So here are the added student services that we are making available to those students based on our knowledge and experience in offering these kinds of programs.
And I think along that line, if you have an assessment that is a self-assessment with the key at the bottom, there's going to be some questions that come out of that. Those savvy students who can see the key that's going to allow them to enroll and are going to answer it, are they answering it based on the key at the bottom, or are they really doing some self-reflection to be able to be successful in the program that you are offering? You spoke briefly about post or secondary use of technology too as part of this. And it's possible that that student who did distance education learning at the secondary level used a completely different platform or technology than what you use at your institution. And so while they may have done it in another platform, you want to make sure that they're able to do it in your platform too. And while there are similarities across all platforms, there are intricate aspects to it that are important that that student can do, again, ahead of enrollment, ahead of that matriculation
Yeah,
occurring.
and again, how intuitive do you need students to be to work within your technical components? And so, given that range of technological savvy that students may have, what resources are available? And again, we are basing our comments on real life interaction with institutions, also real life interaction with students, particularly in student complaints. And this is an area that has been of significant uptick for ACCSC and receiving complaints around distance education programs, and really kind of the support and the preparation that students receive. And so we just, again, want institutions to be mindful, to be listening, to be looking for ways to engage with students and to hear what their struggles might be. And then to try and fill in those gaps with the appropriate kinds of resources that are going to help students be successful in the long term. Short term, stay in school. Long term, succeed in the program and be successful in the workforce.
And I think we've pulled this one out separately because we find that this is a common finding.
Right. Okay. So we want to take a minute and just talk a little bit about consortium and partnership agreements, because this is oftentimes how institutions engage. So I'm gonna take the 30,000 foot here, and then Alicia's gonna talk a little bit about what it really means. So typically, there needs to be an institution that has what we call locus of approval, or the centrality. One campus, particularly if we're talking about in a multi-campus group or in some kind of partnership arrangement or some kind of consortium with amongst institutions, at least one institution has to have that locus of approval. The approval has to live somewhere. It can't just be applied to the corporation. It can't be applied to the owner. It can't be applied to the group across. ACCSC is an institutional accreditor. And so now a group of institutions can choose to have every single one of the campuses have their own independent locus of approval. Or a group of institutions can choose to have one campus, a home campus, a host campus, have the centrality, the central approval or the locus of approval. And the other campuses within the group would enter into an arrangement, some form of consortium or partnership for that host institution to provide education to the home institution. And this is another one where this can play out in a variety of ways, as many ways as the Marvel multi-universe. And so it can be confusing because of that. Which Spider-Man are we talking about? I don't know. So, where does that locus of approval live? And how does it interact? Is it a 100% distance education program? Or is it a hybrid? And how do those things work? So, Alicia, talk a little bit about the difference between the home institution and the host.
Sure. So that host institution, that's going to be the locus of control that Michael referred to. That's going to be the institution that houses, that is responsible for that distance education component. And I know, the examples you gave were a host institution and a home institution, or everybody having distance education approval. And there's a wide spectrum to that too. It could be that there's a host institution for one program, And there are home institutions that have distance education approval in addition to the consortium partnership agreement. So be aware there are a variety of things out there. Please reach out to staff. Let's talk about what you're doing and what that looks like. We've had consortium partnerships around for quite a bit of time. And so we have some that predate the pandemic and COVID. And out of the pandemic, we have found that some schools may have made some adjustments to those previously approved consortium partnership agreements. So be aware that if you've changed courses or changed programs or even had a new institution come in, maybe you have a new branch that joined your consortium, those notifications and that information has to be shared with ACCSC. So if you've made modifications, again, please reach out to staff. Let's talk about what that looks like ahead of that on-site evaluation team coming in. But I think you originally asked me to talk about home and host institutions. And
yeah,
sidetracked.
No, you did great. You did great. So I'm a student.
Yes.
And I go to a campus in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay.
And there's a big sign that says, sign up for online education or online program. And so I go in, and that Phoenix campus is part of a larger group. And the host institution's actually in Colorado, in Denver. Am I signing up at the Phoenix campus, or am I signing up at the Colorado campus?
Generally, what we see is that you're signing up the Colorado campus.
But I'm in Phoenix.
I'm aware.
Okay, I'm confused.
I know, it's okay. Generally, what we've seen is that you are signing up at the Colorado campus because that is the campus that has the 100% online.
Yes, I see now. Okay. Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. Yes. So again, that host campus, if it was what if the program was more like a hybrid program where I'm going to take some of it in Phoenix and some through the host institute?
Well, as long as you are taking at least 25%.
Yes, I see that on the slide.
At that home institution, then you can sign up at the home institution for that program.
Got it. Because the host institution is simply providing the methodology and the platform for that student to take that via consortium agreement. And I'm really going to get my diploma or degree from the campus in Phoenix.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Yes.
Couple of things to add to that, though, not maybe that example, but just to be aware that if you are in a consortium partnership, there is still that requirement for that admissions assessment because you are still taking coursework in an online environment. So that still has to happen. There's still the program advisory distance education member requirement because, again, part of the program is being done in a distance education modality in that environment. There still needs to be that conversation. And so we sometimes see where it's the consortium, only the host institution has to do that. But there are those still requirements for the home institutions because it is based on the student, not necessarily where that modality originates from. Okay,
very good. All right, well, let's move on. We're going to take a little bit of time now. I'm going to go over to the Q&A. Is it in the Q&A, Michelle?
Well, I can just read you two. I've been answering the questions here live, but I have two
Thank you for your support.
We have two questions that I thought maybe the entire audience would like to hear from you about. So we talked about PAC earlier, and so we just want a little more clarification. We talked about that schools can have one distance education reviewer on PAC to review all programs. And this is sufficient as long as they offer feedback on DE for each program. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that's feedback is, again, on the platform and what students are doing in that distance education modality. So the individual course that's being offered, as long as the assessment piece has been done prior to offering this program and it fits and it makes sense to do it for this type of program in that modality, right? The distance education PAC member is going to speak to the platform and the interactions that are occurring. And then the individual program advisory committees are going to talk about coursework and those aspects to it. So we talked about doing, again, a best practice of all of the programs together with the distance education member, and then a breakout so that those curriculum pieces, specifics can be discussed. Now, that's not to say if a program advisory committee determined that maybe one of the courses isn't great to do in a distance education environment, or have feedback for and want to get feedback and conversation with that distance education PAC member, that's again why they all have to come together, and your distance education person can't be over here away from everybody else, because that conversation has to happen about it as part of that feedback loop that the PAC provides.
Yeah, and I think that is, if I'm going to boil it down, elevate substance over form. Why is it important for a distance education contributor to a program advisory committee? And that's precisely what Alicia is getting at. It's not check the box, we've got somebody with some background to look at this. It's let's look at what's working and what's maybe not working in this environment. And it might be a course by course review.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are so many metrics to look at. Why are all the students recording a D in this course? Is it a teaching issue? Is it a platform issue? Is it a methods issue? Is it equipment or lack thereof? I mean, there are so many things, and it's the engagement of that kind of distance education evaluator to say, well, if we're looking at how the platform supports this particular module or this particular topic, it might be that this isn't sufficiently giving the students practice time or the resources, or it doesn't really let them get their hands on it the way that it might need to. And the grades might be reflecting that. The faculty, their own assessment might lend itself to that. So my take on this really is, while there is a requirement, let's remember what the spirit and intent of it really comes down to. And that is having that fulsome conversation around what's working and what might not be working.
Agreed.
Michelle.
So I'm going to give you two a break from speaking just for a moment, because I'm going to be able to answer these questions. So yes, we are going to have this webinar recorded.
Okay.
And you will all get a copy of the presentation. It should be up and available tomorrow. And if you need more direct information about DE PAC members or distance education, we'll also have our contact us email addresses available. Now, your next question. This is kind of a hybrid question. Can you provide an overview of online course credit hour requirements and discuss how to differentiate between hybrid asynchronous work versus out-of-class assignments?
I'm going to take the last one first, because I forget things very easily these days. But that's an important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And Alicia and I were just chatting about this before in our 7 minutes of preparation before we did this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, not every every time I touch a computer doesn't make a component of a course be distance education. I may have an assignment in a lab to watch a video. That doesn't necessarily make that lab work distance education. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I may even have a requirement to watch a video in a lecture or a movie or some other kind of resource. Does that make that didactic portion automatically distance education?
Does not.
No. So what you're looking for are when it is a formal process and it is an engagement issue. So for you, Alicia, what is the thing that kind of flips that switch?
I think for me, it's seat time.
Okay.
When it replaces seat time is when it is distance education modality.
Right. So it's not that it's just a supplemental, it supplants it.
No, and you can have an LMS in an online environment that students do homework in, that students go and get resource materials from, and that is not distance education.
Right. Yeah.
in and of itself.
So, having an assignment again where you work through using a computer, a trouble code, and that's part of the lab. Again, those resources are simply supplementing the lab work and the other. Now, there's one other component here that I think is important to also talk about, because we didn't really touch on it, but the commission has also expressed this allowance for institutions to use distance education modalities when it is not necessarily a formal part of their instruction. And so those would be instances, and there's an alert that describes this. A student is ill, and they're going to be out of school for 2 weeks. They can't, you have to convalesce at home or even in a hospital. I mean, they're well enough to engage the curriculum, but they're not well enough to attend the school. So the school says, well, we can accommodate this student. We've got enough tools and resources here that we can, through video technology and sharing and email and some other resources, we can do enough over 2 or 3 weeks to keep this student engaged and keep them up to speed so they don't have to drop out. But they're not going to be in class. Is that, do I have to get that approved as distance ed?
No, again, that, because it is not the formalized process piece, that's why we started with the definition.
Right.
To provide that foundation for this. As long as it is emergency use, temporary use, not an ongoing formal thing that students go through, it would not then be distance education. It would not require the approval. It would not require notification or adjustment or reaching out in those ways. There should be some policy or reference to that in your catalog so that students are aware that this exists. And maybe it's not in the student catalog, but it should be somewhere that when this occurs, you are being consistent among those students in those situations.
Yes, in exceptional cases.
Correct.
If it is we always offer to you at any given time the opportunity to take these courses by distance, then you need to get that approved as distance education.
Right.
If it is for exceptional and isolated cases, student by student and their circumstances, then you can provide that kind of education for those exceptional and individual circumstances.
Exactly.
Yes. Any other questions, Michelle?
Well, this one kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation when you touched on federal financial aid. What if the course is a hybrid course that includes asynchronous courses online? Would it still mean that you can't receive financial aid? Do we know the answer?
I'm not going to answer any federal financial aid questions, particularly not knowing how that would apply. So I would encourage any questions about eligibility for federal financial aid to be taken up with your case manager. Okay, well, thank you for monitoring the chat. I hope that we've covered, I think, touched on the high points, we just really want to prepare institutions again as you're going through this next renewal, and you got that distance education approval for the very first time. This is going to be something that will be addressed, reviewed, and assessed at probably a more significant level than the original application process itself, particularly if that was done in reaction and in response to the COVID pandemic national emergency. So we want institutions to be prepared. If we can provide additional information, again, please reach out to us. We'll do our best to get those questions answered. But otherwise, I hope that this has been useful for institutions. Hope that will translate into better opportunities for students. With that, we will sign off. So thank you all for your time this afternoon.